All right, everybody?
All good?
Yeah, good. Okay. Thank you, and good afternoon, AES. I would like to dedicate this address to the memory of my mother, Eileen, who died last June. She was a pioneer as a female aircraft engineer in the 1950s, and then later an inspirational teacher of disabled children. She promoted and ran wheelchair dancing clubs for adults and children throughout her retirement, alongside enthusiastic engagement in art, walking and line dancing groups. Her energy, her determination and her steadfast positive outlook were a great inspiration to me, for which I owe her lasting thanks. So, as an academic, working to understand and promote more environmentally and socially sensitive approaches to farming and rural development, I also wish to thank this society. My first AES conference was at Newcastle in 1986, and although there was a period in the 1990s when working for a government agency didn't allow me much conference attendance, I have been a regular supporter and contributor ever since. I began by feeling quite an outsider, an environmental critic of orthodox economics. I suppose I haven't changed a great deal, but the Society has proved generous and broad-minded enough to enable those criticisms to be aired and shared. And today, AES conferences showcase excellent work on sustainable agriculture and agri-food topics, as well as recognising the global relevance of sustainable rural development and embracing the urgency of the climate agenda. We've come a long way together. So I'm extremely honoured and humbled to have been elected as the Society's president for 2021. And I hope that with this address, I can give a little something back to all those members, past and present, who've given me food for thought and much support in my career. You know who you are. My aim is to consider how research can better facilitate the transformation of agri-food and rural policy and practice over the next decade in response to the global challenges of climate change and biodiversity decline. I'll be defining my terms. Then I'll be taking some policy and practice lessons from my own past research experience. You'll see some familiar slides if you've heard me present before. And then finally, suggesting some concepts, priorities and challenges for future research, which is where the real important part of the presentation is. So I also find parallels in the work of some more eminent economists in recent times. And it seems to me that there is an emerging consensus now about the need to refocus economic inquiry and to reconsider the methods that we use in the face of our current challenges. Hopefully, this address can inspire more agricultural economists to embrace that consensus and to pursue ambitious and impactful research. So, defining terms, policy analysis and not evaluation. And that's because this means learning from policy, but also learning for policy. Evaluation too often becomes reduced to seeing how far a policy instrument or programme has delivered what you expected, without the resource or the permission to consider much else. Analysis is what an independent academic should always have the freedom to do, defining their own boundaries and seeking to advance thinking and understanding about the whole complex business of policy making. Rural resilience must these days be defined by reference to the values enshrined within the UN Sustainable Development Goals. These cover natural, human and social elements, from climate action and ending hunger to social justice and gender equality. Resilience is key to coping with increasing conditions of global change and uncertainty. And as economists, we recognise that many precious resources are limited and vulnerable to these conditions. At the December conference, Peter Feint, presenting on the Shore Farm project, gave an excellent clarification of resilience in the context of agri-food and rural policy. He identified 3 degrees of resilience: robustness, adaptability and transformation, and highlighted how today's challenges require transformation resilience, because robustness and adaptation alone will not be sufficient to prevent system crisis. He further stated that policy support for transformation is generally underdeveloped, and I definitely agree with him. So I want to look at how we can develop better policy support for transformation, particularly via the task of policy analysis, working as applied economists in the domain of agri-food and rural. For me, the term expanding toolkits means a few key things. Too often, policy analysis is narrowly instrumental, by which I mean both that it often examines instruments and goals in a piecemeal or partial fashion, and this is inadequate. If you consider just the simplest transaction, like buying a loaf of bread from your local bakery, you recognise that the goals of those who are transacting are multiple and influenced by a range of interconnected economic, social and environmental factors. So much more is this the case when we're considering policies and policy instruments or measures operating in a variety of local conditions and seeking to strike an appropriate balance between multiple goals at different scales. So analysis needs to move from the partial and piecemeal towards the more holistic and interconnected. And this challenges both the concepts or framings that are applied in policy analysis, as well as its methods and ways of working. Meeting the challenges of climate crisis and transformation has to mean more than finding new ways to manipulate empirical data, no matter how interesting that is in itself and how useful as part of a bigger picture. But neither can it be just about nudging people to make incremental changes to behaviour without really altering perceptions and understanding, because we don't have the time to move that slowly, and changes now need to be significant and lasting. So I promised to start with a look back at lessons learned from my working life to date, and I'm going to focus in particular on two themes from my own research and experience.
Janet, I think you may have accidentally muted.
I apologise, I'm not sure how that happened. So the first was inspired by ecology. This seminal paper, which I'd recommend to anybody who's interested, marked the birth of ecology as a distinct discipline in the early post-war period. But as with many innovations in thinking during that time, it took about 25 years until it became widespread or mainstream. Watts's paper is couched in very simple language. It seeks to explain and discuss very accessible ideas about how plants coexist in the field. And his key concepts include the idea of many elements acting and interacting together in a dynamic system, which varies in space and time. And key to his analysis is the use of case studies, compared and contrasted, to suggest general principles of how plant communities respond to different underlying conditions. So it's systemic and it's based upon empirical comparison, leading to abstraction and the development of new theory, not the other way around. And this is an approach which I believe works well for policy analysis. My first significant attempt to test this was in my PhD, and I applied a comparative approach to understanding the Common Agricultural Policy, which had been portrayed in the UK in the 1980s as a terrible policy that had wrecked the British countryside, but it was much more popular in other European nations. I wanted to understand how it had influenced the impact of agriculture on rural conservation, and I made an empirical study using mixed methods and combining environmental and socioeconomic analysis to understand CAP impacts in Normandy and Wales since the early 1970s. The research enabled me to explain why the CAP seemed to work so well to support farms and the environment in France, and yet to drive rural environmental and social decline in the UK. So my simile is a water wheel, and that's why you've got the picture there, which is my village in the Cotswolds. So if a water wheel is a model of the agricultural system within a country, and the money of the CAP is the water which flows over the wheel and makes it turn, and the consequences of that movement are changes in farming structures and practices. Imagine French farming as being the water wheel, but restrained by applying brakes. In this case, the water passing over it will fill the little cups all over the wheel, but won't drive any movement. So in our model, French farms all get a little bit richer, but their structures and their practices don't change much because other factors, in this case, the laws controlling structural change and holding back enlargement and specialisation, prevent that. But imagine UK farming as the water wheel left free to turn, the laissez-faire classic style that we adopt in the UK, and as you increase the volume of policy support, the wheel turns faster. So in this case, farms are stimulated by CAP support to change more rapidly in response to market trends underpinned by the policy. And that leads to significant farm enlargement, capitalisation and specialisation, as economies of scale, stabilised markets and the Mansholt Plan grants of the 1970s generate a climate for continued investment in new technologies to increase land and labour productivity, simultaneously triggering a hollowing out of farming communities and environmental management practices. And that's where we came in with the critique. So the lesson from the comparative analysis was that context matters because it dramatically changes the impacts of a common policy. But in addition, it showed how this varying context arises not just from biophysical difference, but from political and judicial differences. The underpinning legal and fiscal context, the property rights and the norms of behaviour shape the functioning and the outcomes of market and policy processes and their interlinkages. And this is a key lesson. The economic characteristics of goods, services and markets are not given. They are critically shaped by societal structures and norms as determined by the choices of governments and people. So after the PhD, I worked with Ian Hodge to analyse UK conservation trusts, examining their collaborative behaviour and their close relationship with public policy. And then I worked in the Countryside Commission, as Stephen mentioned, covering agri-environmental schemes, farm conservation advice, hedgerow protection, market initiatives for green farming and LEADER.
Janet, sorry to interrupt. The slides have gone, I think.
Have gone. How interesting. I wonder how that happened. How do these machines do what they do? It should be.
I think the water wheel's going too fast.
Maybe is it? Is that the problem? Yes. We lost it. It should work again now.
I think we're good.
I would like to resume from slide 8. There we are. How are we doing? Is that okay for you now?
Perfect.
Good. So I basically had a decade of policy analysis at the Countryside Commission and then at the IEP in London. And in this decade, I learned a few key points about policies. Firstly, they don't act alone or in a vacuum. And this is obvious, but it's all too easily overlooked. Policy instruments interact in the real world, and it's the combined effect of those interactions that we live with alongside other drivers. And secondly, they can be very difficult to judge in complex and dynamic situations. The critical importance of diagnosis, or what other people have called the theory of change, and of process evaluation were highlighted. If evaluation is to serve the twin purposes of public accountability and policy learning, then measuring impacts is not enough. We need much better understanding about how those impacts are generated. This led me to recognise the need for systems thinking in the pursuit of better policies. This diagram, which I've used in many presentations to farming and policy audiences since then, tries to illustrate how powerful it can be to consider the key elements and interlinkages within a system when aiming to predict future change and set priorities for policy. So we consider starting with a temperature increase. So this is a climate change sort of system. And we think about the direct effects, the implications for production, and then into land use. And then we consider the combined impacts from different pathways of change. And finally, we see a whole array of interconnected changes with significant and complex implications for the future. So you've got the agricultural stuff on the one side, you've got the wider land use change on the other, and then together they lead to considerable change at the landscape scale and perhaps a recognition of the need for a more directive approach to thinking about landscape scale management. So a systems approach is also very valuable for effective policy evaluation, and I took that realization into my later work. So this is a slide which summarizes some of the outcomes from the RUDI project, Rural Development Impacts, which was a Horizon project, or was it FP7, looking at the second pillar of the CAP. And in it, we applied a systemic approach to understanding rural development policy, considering both impacts and policy processes, and building a holistic appreciation of the scope for policy enhancement in a context of continuing reform. The work showed the value of territorial policy analysis and understanding the views and experiences of those at the sharp end, which is a really key part of appreciating the effects of a policy in the real world. And that enabled us to identify some new ideas about how to analyse policy processes in a more systemic way, borrowing techniques from other traditions and refining ideas in collaboration with stakeholders. So this diagram, which some of you will have seen before definitely, was a kind of territorial analysis of what was going on wrong with agri-environmental policies in the English uplands at the time that we were doing this work in around 2010. So this is the classic, almost like a transhumance example of how a traditional system would manage an upland landscape using the top, the middle and the bottom of the contours in an integrated way. The problem that we faced was that with agri-environmental schemes focusing very much on the most environmentally valuable land on the top of the hill and paying people to reduce grazing densities there, combined with a change towards a decoupled support regime that came through in 2005, that basically reduced the economic interest for operators in managing that land. You then combine that with the fact that in the valley bottoms, the introduction of nitrate vulnerable zones was basically acting as a disincentive for people to remain in dairy farming in those areas. So people left dairy farming, which meant that over the winter, the land which had previously been available for overwintering your ewe lambs as a hill farmer was no longer available because it was occupied by sheep and beef farms in the valley bottom, replacing the dairy. On top of that, you then had the challenge of bovine TB, which affected the whole incentives to move stock around the farm and basically stopped a lot of those traditional practices of moving in order to maximize the benefit of the resource that you have. The net result is that the system starts to break down, the traditional system of management, and that the CAP Pillar 2 subsidies are insufficient to counteract all these other influences in respect of maintaining the management on the most valuable land from a biodiversity perspective, and also just fragmenting the way that the landscape is held together. In respect of the change for the farming systems, farmers become more stretched because they have to keep getting bigger to keep afloat. Management practices are declining, and actually in the longer term, the process is no longer socially or environmentally sustainable. So those kinds of approach, it seems to me, are a very powerful way of understanding both the challenges and the opportunities for change in a policy context. Other researchers recognize the value of systemic approaches, and this slide is talking about the powerful method of a comparative agriculture, which is taught by friends and colleagues at AgroParisTech in Paris. And for the past decade, I've been really keen to welcome their master's students over to CCRI, where they analyse farming in different parts of England and Wales. And that has helped me to build a much more detailed understanding of farming systems in different landscapes. The method involves an agrarian diagnosis using geography, geology, history, agronomy, and agricultural economics. It's territorial and it's systemic, and it gives a fine grain of spatial detail, which is too often lacking from more conventional sector-based analyses. And I think some of you will have been at Theo's presentation, Theo Lenormand, my PhD student, who's co-sponsored by the Welsh Government at the moment to do this kind of analysis in different parts of Wales to help anticipate and support the process of policy change there. his diagram here just is showing different farms and their integration in the landscape, so interdependence between different holdings in that context. Moving on, in the Horizon 2020 Pegasus project, which we completed in 2018, our team had the opportunity to critique the fashionable and somewhat competing concepts of public goods and ecosystem services, identifying how each one had only partial ability to capture how farming and environmental assets and services are interrelated. So we identified and developed an analytical approach using the theory of social ecological systems, which we felt better reflects agri-environment interactions and enables more creative thinking about policy. The approach is illustrated by this diagram, which kind of walks you through the interrelationships between different assets and the production process in agriculture and forestry, and the way in which that then generates bundles of goods and services influenced by judicial and policy choices in respect of what becomes then a public good or a private good. And then the feedback effect in respect of knock-on implications for those assets in the system. And the whole process is affected by different kinds of drivers. On the one hand, you have the societal drivers, on the other, the biophysical. So again, this kind of concept is not unique. I was lucky enough to visit Japan in 2017 and 18, and Japan's concept of Satoyama and the international IPSI partnership that was launched at Nagoya in 2010 convinced me that Japanese academics, policymakers and stakeholders identify many of the same system interlinkages. IPSI uses the term social ecological production landscapes to characterize how these systems showcase the notion that nature and culture can work together, rejecting simplistic trade-offs between food production, environmental quality and social value, which have been so prevalent in UK land use thinking, the sparing and sharing debate and all that. The important thing too about the Japanese approach is that it isn't just about knowledge, it's also about values. So anyway, the need for systems approaches was my first key lesson from the past. The second one, which is equally important to me, developed more recently from focusing on the need to better integrate environmental and social values into farm and business theory and practice. And I believe this is critical to future rural resilience. In overview, the big picture message is how contemporary understanding of the nature of roles and relationships in ecosystems can inform and help to reshape along more sustainable lines our understanding of economies and businesses. We've operated over the past century with a simple view of economic interactions that closely mirrors what I would call Darwinist, not necessarily Darwin's, but Darwinist theories about interactions in nature. And in brief, that's all about survival of the fittest, a very reductionist approach to Darwin's theory of evolution, which fed into the classic theory of competitive market behavior as the two things kind of co-evolved. It reinterpreted Adam Smith's original descriptions of the virtues of exchange, driven by enlightened self-interest, as a kind of blanket blueprint for markets as a whole, in which, so long as perfect competition is assured, the allocation of resources should be perfectly efficient, and we should be attaining situations of maximum welfare. In reality, we all know that markets seldom work with such unbiased precision. Ecological theory offers us a different and potentially equally valid way to explore transactions and markets in economics, emphasizing different qualities of human and business behavior. And there is a growing body of evidence supporting the validity of some of these approaches. I just highlighted David Zilberman's brilliant work on punctuated disequilibrium as a model of innovation in markets, which basically challenges the idea that firms really directly compete with each other, and talks much more about market niches and advantage in respect of seeing the gaps to be filled. So with colleagues at CCRI and what is now the James Hutton Institute, We did a study over 15 years ago now on how to encourage positive environmental behaviour among farmers and land managers. And I was thinking when Ada gave her talk yesterday that we're on the same page in this respect. This study for DEFRA identified a series of multiple influences applying simultaneously to farm decision making at different scales. And the main message of this diagram, click in the right place, is that policymakers can't expect to achieve change by addressing just one scale of action and motivation if it's contradicted or undermined by other scales of activity. So it's important to understand the full picture if you want to convert people to new ways of doing things, which was the purpose of DEFRA investing in this project. Inconsistency in the policy message at different scales of activity was, in my view, an important part of poor performance of English agri-environmental schemes during the late 1990s and early 2000s. These are the kind of principles that came from our work, but they were also picked up very strongly in an excellent PhD thesis by Gilly Hall, one of my former colleagues at the Countryside Commission. Moving on, I was very privileged to be a member of the National Trust's Rural Enterprise Panel for 9 years during the last decade. And through many visits together to properties and tenant farms, the group examined farm business motivations and environmental goals together, trying to suggest opportunities and resolve conflicts for different people in different places. I also learned a lot from LEADER, from studying this innovative approach to bottom-up integrated rural development across Europe. And these experiences together led me to recognize alternative ways of characterizing business success based on the personal motivations and values of farmers and rural entrepreneurs. This slide captures just some common elements, which are about fit with personalities, reputation, and self-worth, different kinds of quality, and for some, a sufficiency of scale over the long term, rather than growth in its own right as an objective. Many such businesses really focus on the key qualities of trust, reciprocity, and respect in their operations in markets. Moving on from the individual business to think about trajectories of change, this slide critiques dominant trends in perceptions about how businesses should develop over time. And particularly in the context of sustainable development, I've become very dissatisfied with outcomes of the persistent trajectory of economies of scale, which seem to me to do few favours to farming communities or to the environment in the long term. As analysts and theorists, I think we haven't done enough to question whether business growth and increased labour productivity are either desirable or inevitable for farms, given where we are now in the developed world with farming structures. If we can build our measurements of business success around wider perspectives, we might promote quite different trajectories of development. This is a diagram that I've used in respect of trying to explain how LEADER works, but I think it's quite relevant in this context because it's about kind of rethinking models for rural business. And LEADER always begins with this kind of audit of assets and thinking about what assets have you got in the local community and how could you make a business from them. And there are lots of different options depending on how creative you are in thinking about putting those links together between different actors and different assets. And you can generate kind of fairly standard links for adding value, or you can think of rather more novel ones. And in the end, you end up with a great range of potential for doing commercial activities and social enterprise going forwards. I've come across lots of examples of businesses in rural contexts which exemplify the characteristics of value-added, place-based and sustainable enterprise. And these are just a few. I haven't got time to go into them in detail, but just to show you that, you know, there are lots of motivations, there are lots of models, and I think we do the sector a disservice by perhaps not thinking enough about the originality and the diversity of what's out there. So we're final part of the narrative now, future challenges. The IPCC doesn't mince its words about the need for change. It calls for unprecedented transitions in all aspects of society, and soon. And in a more recent report, while I couldn't hope to understand all the maths that's in it, the Dasgupta report says some quite important things going forward. And it's almost salutary for me to see stuff that was being talked about 30 years ago in the context of limits to growth coming back into a very contemporary report on the future in respect of biodiversity. So if we bear in mind those lessons of the past that I just discussed, how can we move forward in applied economic research? Firstly, I believe we need to enable economics to be more open to disciplinary expansion and even migration if it's to analyse processes of exchange and support the wise allocation of scarce resources to meet our pressing 21st century goals. Recognising the limitations of working too narrowly with market signals and pricing alone, we need to combine economic perspectives with those from sociology and psychology, law and politics, environmental science and geography, and to have an eye on ethics and systems mathematics to better reflect these goals. That's quite an agenda, I guess. But it seems to me all of these areas have something to offer us moving forwards. So why should we be constrained to using only part of the picture? And it's part of this kind of identity thing about what is an economist. It's about resource allocation, isn't it? It doesn't have to be about just maths and money. I've been very encouraged to see other more eminent than me women economists promoting similar messages to those covered here. So Mariana Mazzucato highlights the importance of understanding what is valued and being explicit about societal priorities in future economic analysis. She also talks about policy's role in co-creating markets and value, and that's a key point from our Pegasus project. And Sheila Dow states how ethics are unavoidably mixed up in economics and calls for a more systemic and pluralist approach to its practice. So I've picked up just 3 themes for the future in the field of agricultural economics, which I think will be critical to supporting successful transformation for rural resilience. I'm sure there are others, but hopefully these are sufficient for today's purpose. I think I've only time to go through these 3, certainly. I don't claim particular expertise in all of them, but hopefully just enough insight to inspire some closer interrogation by you, because after all, it's you who are the future as researchers and policy analysts. So the first one, governance. Identifying, analysing and fostering enhanced governance seems to me to be something we urgently need to address for policy learning. We increasingly recognise the public interest in privately held land and resources, but we need better and more sustained and less bureaucratic and more empowering ways to bring this to bear in future land management. Through new post-Brexit policies in England, for example, or the rest of the UK, or more widely across Europe, where people are still debating the next step of the CAP reform. The ELM tests and trials in England and discussions and developments across the UK are generating a vast array of local knowledge and engagement in environmental mapping, measuring and management among a whole range of stakeholders, including farmers, environmental NGOs, and many more. And I think as agricultural economists, we urgently need to engage with these processes to develop appropriate agri-economic analysis and input to shape how those policies roll out. And we need to draw from institutional, behavioural and judicial theory, as well as economics and business understanding, to help support and facilitate this agenda. We need to provide policymakers with evidence and ideas to give them the confidence and the trust to change entrenched and overly centralised ways of working in this area. In Pegasus, we identified the central role of social processes in that context. We documented and analysed conditions and practices which could reinforce beneficial change via action-oriented and participatory research with stakeholders and policymakers. And I think there's an awful lot more that can still be done in that arena going forward. The second area, food systems. isn't my special area, but it's one which I think is incredibly important. And the AES conference in December showcased a lot of good work in this area. I think it presents us with some key needs to understand and measure the influence of supply chain inequalities, poor information, and classically chaotic systems behaviour. It offers enhanced opportunities to pursue a more balanced net zero agenda than we will achieve by considering farming and forestry in isolation. As the European Commission puts it in its Farm to Fork strategy, this involves many actors working together. It also means challenging the reductionism inbuilt in the economic convention of intervention only to correct market failure, which in my view so badly misrepresents the problems generated in these systems and the options for addressing them. I think partnership between private and public efforts is an essential element in building more resilient futures here because of the role of the corporate and the private drivers in the food system, which we can't ignore and which we need to work with. But where are the economic theories and the tools that can analyse what goes wrong and why in current food systems? How can we design more efficient joint action? And what can we learn from other countries or policy areas where partnerships are more common? Now, I know from the conference already that lots of people are looking at some of these issues, which really makes me pleased. Finally, the domain of rural enterprise and innovation is one where I think a lot of new work is needed to allow economics to catch up with shifting societal needs. For sustainable resource use, we need to promote analysis with a triple bottom line perspective, looking to encourage businesses simultaneously to fulfill economic, social and environmental goals, rather than only one of these at the expense of others. And that means holistic and dynamic performance measurement with new tools and benchmarks, as well as investigating how they can reshape market norms and standards. In that context, I'm increasingly concerned about the prevalence right now in the policy arena of discussions about the need to improve agricultural productivity when that's still measured in a very conventional economic sense. And by ignoring in particular the importance of the social leg of the sustainability tool, I fear that our vision on this front is unbalanced and our stool will not be resilient. Pointedly, why should we try to minimize the input of some of our most precious renewable resources in agriculture, by which I mean our human and social capital? And why should we eliminate our reliance on non-renewables and protect nature, culture and well-being? Evidence suggests to me that we should be arresting and even reversing in some situations the substitution of labour for capital that we've seen for so long. Careful environmental management combined with sustainable food production and energy generation, all in the same place at the same time, needs expertise and headroom for planning and skilled and valued people on the ground, not overworked farmers who look efficient because their labour force is stripped to an absolute minimum. Good value-added business can generate this headroom, but fostering it requires upfront investment and advice. And it seems to me it's neither ethical nor efficient to just withdraw subsidy and wait for the dust to settle on a further concentrated sector with fewer people trying to manage the resource. And yet this is what I fear some economists and policymakers believe is where we're headed now in the UK. That's my rant. Rural enterprise and innovation is where I particularly hope to be doing more work in the next few years through involvement in a great new initiative, the National Innovation Centre for Rural Enterprise, a partnership with Newcastle and the Enterprise Research Centre at Warwick. Rural business needs more visibility, in my view, better engagement and more innovative and holistic analyses to help navigate a route through COVID and the climate emergencies. I believe shared capacity building through facilitation and co-created research and development offers a major opportunity here. We need to devise better ways to enable economic analysis to reflect the broad range of goals that both society and individuals aspire to achieve. So, summing up what these research areas might require by way of tools, we clearly need a mixed approach and one which can fully embrace systems analysis. It should be able to challenge orthodoxies in standard microeconomic theory and market analysis, redesigning our tools of measurement and optimization, but also applying alternative perspectives. For example, even reconsidering theories of value, perhaps, to better reflect current situations and accommodate future needs. We need to strip out the baggage of terms and methods which lock economics into a narrow focus on partial financial snapshots and seeing price as synonymous with value. And we should work actively with expertise from other disciplines to enable more holistic and integrated understanding of complex problems and potential solutions. For me, understanding how to reverse the hollowing out and asset stripping pattern of farming change over the past half century, to re-enthuse citizens, investors, policymakers and young entrepreneurs in the art of sustainable multifunctional rural resource management, and to better bring long-term practitioner knowledge into the centre of policymaking would be a worthwhile agenda. Revaluing primary production and its role, and ensuring that people and nature can more strongly reconnect through that process would be the broad aspiration behind this. So I want to end with a story from my brief time in Japan. This lovely man on the left here, Takahisa Hinata, was working as an agricultural economist and a rural development advisor in Sapporo, the capital of Japan's North Island, Hokkaido. This place has suffered the classic challenges of late 20th century retreat from marginal areas, similar to what we see in parts of Northern Europe. Takahisa and I spent a week together exploring the island and discussing its challenges and prospects. And in a small village, we met a farmer in his 40s with a young family. He'd returned to the village at the behest of his father, they still do that in Japan, to take over the family farm. He was growing tomatoes and aubergines in polytunnels and some outdoor vegetables on a small plot, and was developing local markets for his produce. He left Hokkaido as a teenager to go to university and had been working since then in IT development in Tokyo. I asked him how he felt about the change in his life, making this classic Japanese U-turn going back to his village of birth. And he told me this: 10 years ago, I worked for 12 hours a day in an office with no natural light, and I had a permanent cold sweat from the pressures of my job, and I was not in control of my life. Today, I work fewer hours in the outdoors, and I have a healthy, warm sweat. And although it's been some years in development, this year I made more money from my vegetables than I ever earned in my job in Tokyo. And I'm free to make my own decisions. I would like to think that in our work, we could help more people to have the opportunity that that guy had in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janet. At this point, I think, and I can see a few people, there would be applause, and it would be very loud applause. So if we could show our appreciation using the virtual format. Now, I noticed the time. Janet, you did say, and I know, Wilfred, we don't normally take questions for the presidential address, but Janet, you did mention that you'd be willing to...
I'm happy to. Yeah, could Katie get rid of the slides now and get us back to the... Thank you. I'm happy to take some questions if there are any.
So if anyone would like to ask a question, and then just raise your hand in the usual way, or indeed make a comment. While people are perhaps thinking, Janet, may I make a comment?
Of course.
So it's one of the things that the phrases that struck me, and there were many, but the hollowing out of agriculture, and then the contrast with the Japanese farmer at the end there. You only have to visit a dairy farm in the UK, or indeed other farms, to realise how hard people are working. You only have to look at the Farm Business Survey. The Fadden data in other countries will probably show the same thing. The amount of often family labour that is going into producing not just food, and this touches on one of the other many things you were mentioning, but the diversity of outcomes that come from farms, particularly in lockdown. I mean, around here, local farm shops, just as an example, it's been very reassuring to know that those exist. And so rural businesses are doing a lot with a very small number of people, and yet we keep banging on about productivity. It's not really a question, it's just an observation.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it's great to look at being productive when you've got models that you're happy with, but where so-called increased productivity is actually just meaning that you have fewer and fewer people managing more and more resource. You know, I think you see it in respect of large dairy farms. You certainly see it in the uplands, people working ridiculous hours in tremendous conditions of stress, with very little support, you know, and yet which way are they going? You know, the economic analysis that Mauro and I did a few years ago shows that, you know, in any particular situation, if you want to improve your business as an individual farm, you're trying to get bigger and you're trying to cut your costs, and you're ending up, you know, with no time or money to manage the landscape, to do all the other things that you could be doing if you could get yourself off that treadmill. So, you know, I think adding value is the answer. I mean, Theo and I have discussions about these things at the moment because he's very taken by the things he's seeing in Wales. And you know, getting people off that idea that the only way to make a living is the kind of the commodity that they've always been producing is a really big challenge. And that's why I get rather upset by a reluctance within the Treasury to view investment in advice as being a good thing, you know? So, yeah. Thank you.
Just very quickly come back on that. In terms of the infrastructure for farming, just talking to farmers, one realizes that the surrounding infrastructure, just from a purely business perspective, the machinery dealer, well, that he or she is now a lot further away than was the case before. There's all sorts of examples of this. It's not just the farming system, it's the
I had a really interesting meeting last week with Monmouthshire County Council's food policy officer, amazing woman called Desiree, and a man in the Brecon Beacons, and there's a pilot project funded by the RDP in Wales looking at trying to recreate local supply chains so that local food producers can supply what is a really huge demand for local food. They're fine with fruit and veg, but when it gets to chickens, the problem with chickens is that the chickens reared in Monmouthshire have to be sent down to Devon for slaughter and then brought back before they can be delivered to the person living next door. And the costs of that make it not economic. And this is a result of a policy pursued by MAF in the 1970s and 80s about efficiency. The idea was that if you wanted to police and ensure food safety and hygiene in slaughterhouses, when the rule came in from the European Commission about veterinary inspections, you didn't go for half qualified vets who were nice and cheap and available. You went for, you know, highly qualified vets, and you ended up shrinking the number of operations that you had to inspect. So it was much more efficient for MAF to have fewer larger slaughterers operating. And at that time, you know, a lot of small ones went out of business. There's a lot of discussion now about, you know, could we bring any of them back? But the guy in the Brecon Beacons said that a new slaughterhouse there would cost £20,000, and none of his individual little producers have that kind of wherewithal. So yeah, there's lots of issues here about infrastructure.
Just time for Wilfred, who has his hand raised.
Could you let Ken? I think Ken wanted to speak.
Apologies.
I wanted to just congratulate on an excellent, thought-provoking, and whether, well, let me say, Janet mentioned about the interdisciplinary, and the economists need to talk to lots of other disciplines. Do other disciplines want to talk to economists?
Oh, definitely. Yes, definitely they do. You just have to make sure they're not too scared of you.
I think
that should be possible. In agricultural economics, we should be good at that. I am going to close things at that point, just because my clock says 3 minutes to 2. There is another session at 2. So if we could show our appreciation again for an excellent presentation. Thank you very much.